We're at a really unserious moment in our politics.
Partisan voices are toxifying not only the way we approach issues across party lines, but also the way we view our fellow Americans.
We believe that there's another angle, thinking seriously about the pressing questions of our day, and realizing that the right answers probably aren't easy ones.
I'm Rena Minetti.
I'm Isaac Willauer.
Courtesy of the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College, welcome to Another Angle.
Well, hello and welcome back to Another Angle. It has been 653 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the beginning of a war with almost 500,000 reported casualties that sparked discussion and debate across the globe as to the changing dynamics of our geopolitical future. But war is more than a political endeavor. It's a profoundly human one. Soldiers, humanitarians, and civilians alike bring untold human calculus and human stories to the table. Today we're here with just one such person, and it's our pleasure to welcome Stephen Moore of the Ukraine Freedom Project. Stephen, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Isaac. Great to be here.
Dude, it's fantastic to have you. So are you in Ukraine right now, or are you in D.C.?
I am in your nation's capital right now.
Wonderful.
And in fact, if I look really hard out the window, I can probably see the Capitol dome.
Dude, that's
So,
fantastic. How much are you?
It is.
How much are you in Ukraine now?
So I have been in Ukraine most of the time since day 5 of the war, and I left Ukraine in November. So to come here for about 3 weeks, and because I feel like I can do more right now in Washington D.C. than I can in Ukraine, I've been here. I don't know. We plan to stay for 3 weeks, and what is today, December 10th or something, and I'm still here. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so why were you in Ukraine in the first place on day 4 of the war?
Yeah. So I lived in Ukraine in 2018, 2019. And like most Americans prior to 2018, I would have had difficulty pointing to Ukraine on a map. And I went there in 2018 and got a job doing public opinion research for one of the local media outlets. And it was super fun. I loved Ukraine. I loved Ukrainians. And let me just tell you, the culture there that is so amazing. It is, people are doing real things. Like in America, we may still have garage bands. I don't really know. I feel like a lot of our music is focus group tested and, ran through an AI algorithm. They have garage bands in Ukraine, and they have young entrepreneurs who are, doing their own line of clothing. There's a huge store the size of Macy's that has nothing but Ukrainian brands in it, and they're all really cool. And Ukraine right now is the second. I mean, this is the story of a country throwing off the yokes of communism, oppression, of the remnants of the Soviet Union, and the story's not over. And it's a really interesting thing to be a part of.
Yeah, no, for sure. So let's go back to, take me back to like February of 2022, and you were in Tulsa, right, when the invasion started. So give me the walkthrough of the invasion to 4 days, 5 days, to you being on the ground in Ukraine. Walk me through that.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I coincidentally had gotten a job with an artificial intelligence firm. It's an American firm, but had like 500 people in Ukraine. So I've been working for those folks for 2.5 years after I left Ukraine, and January 31st of last year, 2022, I decided it was time to leave. It was 2.5 years on this startup hamster wheel, and it was pretty intense. Little did I know what would come next. But I was hanging out with my mom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and my Ukrainian friends were calling me and saying things like, "They're bombing Kyiv. I don't know what to do." And so, I had spent nearly 2 years as a civilian in Iraq at the beginning of that war in 2003, and I knew what to do. So I went there and started trying to help. Started getting my friends out of hot spots like Kyiv and Kharkiv that were really under fire. And, because like everyone else in the world, I thought that the Russians were going to roll through Ukraine in like 3 weeks. And when they didn't, all my friends after about 3 weeks were that wanted to be safe were safe. So I started figuring out other ways to help. I started bringing medicine to the front, food. Um, in those beginning months, the international community was falling incredibly short. As one particularly disappointing example, um, I got a call from a friend of a friend in a small clinic on the outskirts of Kyiv, one of the Kyiv suburbs, and they were taking wounded from a place called Bucha. And as we found out later, we didn't know this at the time, but Bucha was some of the most fierce fighting and some of the most horrific war crimes. And the guy calls me and says, I'm trying to help this clinic. They don't have any medical supplies. Can you help us? And I said, look, dude, I don't want to go to the front. Why don't you call the Red Cross? And he's like, who? And so I went to Romania, bought a bunch of medical supplies, got them up there, and went up there myself. And sure enough, when I got there was no boxes from the Red Cross, nothing in there. This is a month into the war. There's nothing from the UN. All the boxes of stuff there were from St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania,
Oh, wow. Okay.
in some place in France, and I started looking, and I was like, "Where's the Red Cross?" And so I started looking, and they were raising a ton of money off of their activities in Ukraine, but they weren't there, or at least they weren't there anywhere they were needed.
Wow.
So so I have been to the front about a dozen times.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time in Kyiv when it was under siege, in the beginning parts of the war, and again. The Red Cross is particularly, and when I say the Red Cross, I mean the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the folks out of Geneva. And the International Committee of the Red Cross is particularly skilled at raising money. They're not particularly skilled at getting the aid into the hot spots where it's needed. So that was super disappointing.
Yeah, no, for sure. So you go to Ukraine in February of 22. In the intervening year and almost 2 years now, what's been the biggest change, in terms of how the country looks? Obviously, war has taken its toll. What's been the biggest change in terms of what you're seeing, and then the biggest change in terms of how people are viewing the conflict?
Yeah, well, what most Americans aren't getting is that Ukraine is winning this war by any measure that you use. Now, the rate at which it's winning has slowed down dramatically because, and we can go into that, but, I come to the United States, I speak to groups, I speak to congressional staff, I speak to really highly educated opinion leaders who are disproportionate consumers of news, and they ask me things like, can you get food in Kyiv? And, Kyiv has been really highly functioning for well over a year now. My friends that come to Kyiv, and I do have a lot of friends that come to Kyiv, and you guys are welcome. Let me know when you want to come. I asked them, look around, give me the visual cues that you see now that that makes you think we're in a war zone. And I couldn't find lactose-free milk for my cappuccino.
Yeah, okay.
So that is, Kyiv is highly functioning. Most of the country is highly functioning. The Ukrainians have taken back 83% of their country, and it's working pretty well. Now that 17% that the Russians control, every kind of horrible thing that you can imagine is happening there. Rape is a weapon of war. They're raping children. They're raping old women. And the Russians are systematically torturing and murdering Protestant Christians in the occupied territory for their faith. And that is something that doesn't get out there. And and I definitely want to talk about that more. But in terms of
Right.
changes, um, Ukraine is a much better place, and it's doing well. It's on the right foot. It's going through a tough time right now because um, our government can't seem to get its act together and do the right thing, and that is a bipartisan problem. Um, but yeah, it's so Ukraine is better than you think, and it's worse than you think.
Yeah, it's interesting. A buddy of mine was in, I think he was in Kiev, I think about a year ago, and he was talking about staying at the Kiev Hilton. He's like, yeah, there's an app on your phone, and when it goes off, everyone just kind of shelters in place, and then that's the end of it. And I'm like,
Oh, wow.
that is very that's remarkably calm and a lot
Yeah.
more in control than I would have expected from a war zone. But
Right.
Oh yeah. So yeah, just to elaborate on that, I live on the top floor of my apartment complex, and it was really cheap to get that apartment. In a city that's frequented
what do
by
you
drones
mean
and
people
missiles.
don't want to live on the top floor of a building during a war zone when there are missiles in play?
Exactly, shocking but true. Um, that but in even that, it really takes a significant number of drones or missiles for people to pay attention, because usually just nothing particularly worth paying attention to happens.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Drones and missiles are terror weapons. They don't, so I tell my friends here in DC that they are 9 times more likely to die in Washington, DC traffic than I am from a missile or a drone in Kyiv. And so I really worry about my friends here in DC. And but Listen, I did the math. That is a statistical reality.
That's
So
I
wild. Yeah,
believe
no.
that DMV
yeah.
drivers are insane.
Yeah, and if you go
Oh
to
yeah.
A
Oh
Union
yeah.
Station, a rat the size of a dog will just pop out and eat your face.
Yeah, well, and then that doesn't even account for the carjackings or the
Yep.
Yeah,
drive-by shootings or anything else that's
Hmm.
really horrible here in DC right now.
for sure.
Right.
So, yeah,
So, shifting more, we've talked a little bit about the American view of the war in Ukraine. I just want to unpack that a little bit more. Where do you think this left-right binary that's being superimposed on top of the geopolitical conflict comes from?
so it's a complicated question, and to one degree, there's the Russians have gotten into the conservative media cycle. And as one example is Tucker Carlson. He says, "Why aren't we rooting for the Russians? I am," and that's a quote. And so,
Wait, hold on. When did he say that?
um, that is a year ago, something like that. I don't know. I actually looked it up recently. I forgot to look at the date,
I'm gonna
but
Google it. Keep going.
yeah, yeah, please do. So, so Tucker Carlson, as an example, you can. So I'm in Ukraine. I have a lot of friends that are fluent in Russian.
Right.
My COO is fluent in Russian, and she, can show me. Um, Russian propagandists will say something. This is back in the day, whenever Tucker had his own show. But Russian propagandists will say something on Tuesday on their television shows, and they have television shows just like we do, talk shows like we have on, MSNBC, Fox,
Hmm.
and all that, right?
Right.
And so, but they're all controlled by the Kremlin. And so the Kremlin propagandist will say something on Tuesday. Tucker would repeat it on Wednesday, and the Kremlin propagandist would pick it up on Thursday, take a clip from his show, and say, "See, at least one American has it right." So, um,
Yeah, that's never really what you want
Mm,
from Russia.
well, and so, you know, are you doing the right thing? So no one likes Putin. No one likes Russia. 7% of I did a poll of Republican primary voters recently. 7% of them have a positive opinion of Putin or Russia.
You say
Now,
7?
uh, seven,
Okay,
7%. So, which is not bad. You can get 7% of people on a poll to say anything.
for sure.
right.
And so, um, you know, but uh, but for some reason, there's elements of the conservative ecosphere who have sided with Russia, who are taking criminal talking points and are using them, and they're effective. And you know, okay, so Tucker's worth $400 million. I have been for the first 18 months I was in Ukraine, I was a volunteer. So I'm doing this because I believe it's the right thing to do, and God has put me in a position to tell people what's really going on there.
Right.
And so but Tucker Carlson, who gets 10 million views on Twitter every time he comes on, will tweet something, and then Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, will retweet it, and it's nonsense. You know, I mean, it is verifiably untrue, some of the things that they're saying, and so it may not be a 3-minute Google search, but it's a 5-minute Google search, right? So and so that's what we're up against. That's what the truth is up against.
Right. Where do you think these stereotypes on the right stem from?
Like, where do they come from?
Yeah.
Difficult to say, because I've been here in DC for, again, since like November 3rd, and I've talked to at least 50 congressional staff, a bunch of actual members of Congress, and most of them want to do the right thing. Most of them recognize that right now we have an incredibly good opportunity to neutralize one of our longstanding foes in Russia.
Right.
Most of them realize that that we've been spending $800 million to $1 trillion a year for the last several years, and spending on that scale for decades, in part to deter Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent $42 billion on weapons for Ukraine, which is about 5% of the annual budget of the U.S. Department of Defense. So for that amount of money, we've degraded Putin's warfighting capability by half, and we have never lost a U.S. soldier in doing that.
Mm.
And so the money we've spent for Ukraine has been far more effective than anything the U.S. Department of Defense has spent for decades on deterring Russia. So most members of Congress recognize that. There's 50 to 60 that are part of the Hell No Caucus. And, for whatever reason, they hate Ukraine. Zelensky's a pimp. Zelensky's a coke addict. Zelensky's buying villas in the Mediterranean. He's banning Christianity. He's arresting nuns and priests and all this sort of stuff, right? So those are those guys. But and then there's about 80 members of Congress who are going to do the right thing no matter what, because they understand it. And then there's that middle ground, or people that want to do the right thing, but they're just getting the snot beat out of them by their voters.
Right.
And so where does that come from? It comes from Tucker Carlson.
Yep.
It comes from other prominent conservative organizations. This is documented. Jim Garrity wrote about it in the National Review. You can find the Heritage Foundation, and the Heritage Foundation is a long-standing conservative icon that is Reagan, Republican, that sort of stuff, right? From way back in the day. And now you can find Heritage Foundation clips from their videos on Zvezda, which is the official website of the Russian armed forces. You can find, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, quotes the Heritage Foundation by name, and it's all over Russian media, and like hundreds of times. They're by far the most quoted think tank in Washington D.C. I mean, like it's Heritage has got hundreds, and then there's some others that have a couple. So it's perplexing to me that a foreign policy organization like the Heritage Foundation, it's like, okay, here's our national defense strategy, and Vladimir Putin is promoting it, right?
Yeah.
So maybe your adversary is promoting your national defense policy. It's time to find a new national defense policy.
This is fair. Yeah. So let's talk about that national defense policy a little bit. So obviously there's some as much as we'd like to talk about, and maybe we want Ukraine to win, there are a bunch of problems, right? Winter's coming. Their counteroffensive is stalling.
Yeah.
funding is really slumping from the West. Right, so I want to get into that in terms of there's a lot of disagreement on the best way to handle the conflict, fund the conflict, what the United States and NATO needs to be doing. What do you make of that? What's your take? How do you perceive of that whole issue? Putting on the policy hat for a minute.
Yeah, sure. And like I said, I am neck deep in this stuff right now. So right now we've got a bill that's being debated. It's not even a bill yet; it's a concept. I don't think they've written it up and actually attached a bill number to it. But the concept is that it would be $60 billion for Ukraine, $15 billion for border security, $15 billion for Israel, and the balance would go to Taiwan. Those numbers may not be exactly right, but that's the flavor of it. And so it's being negotiated right now, and the Republicans have gotten a lot of media for being opposed to aid to Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and it's rational. We did a poll again at the Ukraine Freedom Project. My organization did a poll of Republican primary voters, and those voters, border security at 58% was the number one priority for them. 58% of Republican primary voters have border security as their top issue of importance. Ukraine aid is down at the bottom with 1%. So the people that are voting for this are doing this at their peril. So,
Yeah.
the people that are voting, so it is electorally foolish for Republicans to vote for this and not vote for Ukraine aid. I'm sorry, for border aid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they'll do it. They will do it if they can get something at the border, if they can get a win at the border. So this is now, so I would tell anyone that would listen that's a pro-Ukraine person for months, say, go talk to Republicans, and tell Republicans what's going on. Now, this is no longer a Republican issue. This is no longer is in the hands of Republicans. It's in the hands of the Democrats, because the Democrats need to find a compromise on border security. So we're about to find out how Joe Biden has said, we'll back Ukraine, quote, as long as it takes. Well, will you back Ukraine if it requires you to come up with a compromise on border security? And let me just add this. Border security is not something that's wildly unpopular. 74% of Americans in a recent NBC News survey support more funding for security along the U.S. border with Mexico. 3/4 of Americans support this, including 93% of Republicans, 74% of independents, and 58% of Democrats.
Wow.
So what you've got is a wildly popular issue in border security, and an issue that has been incredibly, unfortunately, polarized in Ukraine aid. And then you've got, and they're trying to put these two together and get a win for everybody. And for Democrats, what they're concerned about, as I can tell, is they're far left.
Yeah.
Their far left wants open borders, and so 3/4 of America wants more secure borders.
Yeah.
So will the Democrats be able to stand up to their far left and do the right thing and create security for our border and for Ukraine's border?
Right.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the public opinion polls on America on Ukraine aid. Now I want to shift to talking about Ukraine's perspective on the U.S., seeing as you have your feet in both pools, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the question is, what does Ukraine think
What is
about
the
the
Ukrainian
US?
perspective on the United States?
Ukraine loves America. And, again, if you do a poll of Ukrainians, and I've looked at them, and I've forgotten what it is, but like the question they ask is like, which countries do you feel like has done the most for Ukraine? And it's, the United States far and away.
Yeah.
Every day that I'm in Ukraine, someone thanks me for American weapons. I'm here with my colleague, Anna Shvetsova, and we're going on Capitol Hill, and she just thanks everyone she sees for American weapons. because they're keeping her friends at the front alive. They're keeping, I live in Kyiv. American Patriot missiles are keeping me safe from
Yep.
cruise missiles and Shahed drones. So Ukrainians are very thankful. They recognize the debt of gratitude they owe to the United States.
Yeah. Well, and also
And
a
at
lot
the
of those
same time,
missiles are
they're
being
like,
built by
please send
Americans.
more.
Right.
Yeah, no, for
you
sure.
know, so that's what Ukraine looks like.
So I want to ask you about the Ukraine Freedom Project. You've been around the world. You've been in war zones. Ukraine is not the first war zone that you've been in. Um, when you look at the different humanitarian crises that you've seen, you look at Ukraine. What stands out to you as different, and then what specifically does the Ukraine Freedom Project do?
So we have three missions. One is straight ahead humanitarian aid to civilians. And those international organizations that I mentioned earlier are now performing at a much higher level. And some of the international organizations I got to give a lot of credit to. For instance, Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's organization,
Yep.
those guys have been there since the beginning. Every place that I've gone when no one else would go there was had something from Samaritan's Purse there. Those guys are amazing. Those guys have kept millions of Ukrainians alive. Also, out of DC, Jose Andres with World Central Kitchen. Um, every time I go someplace, this is back during the beginning of the war when no one would go to any place dangerous. When the International Committee of the Red Cross was sipping coffee in cafes in Lviv, but Jose Andres' group was there. World Food Program, which is a UN organization, has been there since the beginning and gotten food to the front. So those are a few that I admire. The rest of the people that are very highly effective are small Ukrainian organizations of volunteers. And one of the things we started out, I would go to the front all the time and I would take this stuff personally.
Wow.
Now what I'm doing is I am supporting organizations that we have vetted and that we have worked with that we know are doing good work. And so that's what we're doing now. And because the really good stuff, the really hard work, the really dangerous work is being done by volunteer organizations of Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And so
What is the most dangerous part of that work right now?
well, what location?
Or just which parts of the work are the most dangerous?
Oh, so international organizations are really good at getting food and other supplies to safe parts of Ukraine. And then, they rely on sort of other people, generally speaking, to do that last mile. And that last mile is the difficult part. We've got, there's places like I've spent a lot of time in Kherson. Kherson is right on the front, regularly getting shelled. There's Kherson Oblast, which means Kherson Province,
Hmm.
which is someone should tell Vivek Ramaswamy that it's an oblast, not a province. I don't know if you saw the debate.
I did,
Um,
unfortunately. I hate
yeah,
that I know
yeah.
exactly what
So
you're referring
yeah,
to. It's unfortunate.
yeah, and um, so yeah, just Vivek Ramaswamy just lowers the quality of the debate so much, but I
Mm-hmm.
won't go into that. Um, and Kherson Oblast was liberated in November of last year, and Kherson City is right on the front. I've been there many times, and it's getting shelled all the time, and it's a miserable place to be. It is, yeah. I mean, let me tell your listeners, pray for Kherson because they need it. And um, so just getting the food, getting the stuff there. The second thing that we do is we help. We give non-lethal equipment to members of the military to help them survive. And when I say that, I mean like we've gotten thousands of pieces of body armor people. We've
Yeah.
gotten helmets and Starlinks and generators and eco batteries and all this sort of stuff. We fix trucks, we provide trucks, that sort of thing. So that's the second thing we do. And the third thing we do is we help educate people here in Washington D.C. about what's really going on there. And so, and I've beat up a lot in the conservative ecosphere. The reluctance of the Republicans to vote for Ukraine aid is well documented, but this is a bipartisan problem because I sat with about a dozen national security advisors for U.S. senators a couple of weeks ago, and just went through many of the same things I'm talking to you about, and other things. And they told me, you have done more to sell the war in the last 30 minutes than the president has done since February of 2022.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah,
Oh,
and so
Real shout out to President Biden there. Fantastic.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'll tell you this. There's him selling the war, which I would point out right now that the Ukraine aid bill is being discussed, being negotiated. It's going to be voted on. There's not been a national speech about it. Did he give a speech? I don't think he did. And recently, he's not. There's not a lot of effort to promote this. And I would also say that Charles Schumer, could keep the Senate there until this bill is done. And I'm not aware that's going to happen. It may happen, but it's not. So there is. We're with you as long as it takes. And there's actually, picking up the phone and calling someone and doing something.
Yeah.
So
we're here as long as it takes, unless.
Yeah. Well, and let me tell you something that's even more concerning than that is that during the first year of the war, I didn't have a lot of problem with what the Biden administration was doing. They were getting a bunch of war zones, weapons over to the war zone. It was great. And then suddenly, like after the Kherson and the Kharkiv liberation in November of last year, everything slowed down. And if you look at in January, Biden said, we're going to give you tanks. And it took him 10 months to get the tanks to 31 tanks. Took him 10 months to get them to Ukraine, right?
Wow.
What is the job of the U.S. Department of Defense if not to get weapons to a war zone quickly?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also F-16s. In February, F-16s were a bad idea. In May, they're a good idea. They're still not there.
Right.
The Washington Post reported in July of last year, after the Biden administration had dragged its feet for so long and not getting them the weapons they needed. And so they had to delay the counteroffensive, and gave the Russians an opportunity to build minefields 30 kilometers deep. The Washington Post reported that the Ukrainians only had 15% of the demining equipment that they requested. And I don't know where that's at now, but I know that on the streets in Kyiv, there's like 10 times more people in crutches than there was this time last year.
Wow.
So, so this has been, so in some ways, the Republicans who are asking for a plan, asking for, what does the end state look like? What's our plan to get to victory? They're doing good work. These are good questions to ask. Then there's the Hell No caucus that Zelensky is, buying villas in the Mediterranean. Those guys are not paying very close attention. But there are people they're asking good questions that need to be asked.
Right.
So, yeah. So here's what I'd like to share with your listeners. And that is something I alluded to earlier, is that Russians are torturing and murdering Ukrainian Protestants in a systematic fashion for their faith. And let me elaborate on that. Our missionaries have been going over there for decades, and they've been doing a really good job. Like 1.5 million Ukrainians are Protestant, about 4 to 5% of the population. And, this is coming out of the Soviet Union 30 years ago when nobody was Protestant, and so this is something that our missionaries have done a good job on. Now, let me talk to you for a second about the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church is not a church as you and I would think of it. It's more, and let me just tell you more, and then you can make your own conclusions. But the Russian Orthodox Church, the patriarch in Moscow is a guy named Kirill. Patriarch Kirill recently said, if you die fighting in Ukraine, all your sins will be washed away. If you Google Russian Orthodox priest blessing tanks,
Yeah.
I've seen this.
you will come up with 100 pictures of Russian Orthodox priests in their robes with their sprinkling holy water on tanks. Um, so Patriarch Kirill, according to Soviet archives, was a Soviet KGB agent during the Soviet Union. So the Russian Orthodox Church is a working arm of the Kremlin.
Mm.
And when Russian soldiers go into Ukraine and they occupy areas, they meet Baptists, they meet Presbyterians, they meet other types of Pentecostal Christians, and they say, this is an American religion. You must be an agent of the American government, like our guys are agents of the Kremlin.
Mm.
And they arrest them and they torture them and they, and they destroy their churches. There's a pastor that we're in communication with from a place called Melitopol, which has been under Russian occupation since more or less the first days of the war. And the pastor says there are no more Protestant churches left in Melitopol. And he's got video of the Russians coming in and destroying his church because they've got security cameras. And so they've got this all on video, and we've got the video and we'll share it. We're putting up a website, RussiaTorturesChristians.org. So not quite done yet, but when it is, your folks can go there.
Yeah, no, for sure. Very, very subtle title.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So this is what's happening. I talked to the president of the Lviv Baptist Theological Seminary. I talked to him last week, and he said there's probably as many as 30 Baptist pastors who have been murdered by the Russians.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
how do you think this persecution impacts the general faith and hope of the Ukrainian people? Have they become more religious, or do you see like a general loss of hope?
Yeah, there's a definitely that there is people that are turning towards God because they need this hope, they need this their faith sustains them. I've met so many chaplains, and Isaac, we have a mutual friend, Victor, and
Yep.
And Victor, of course, was a evangelical pastor in Luhansk, and he was taken by the Russians, beaten and tortured for 25 days, in part in the presence of a Russian Orthodox priest
Part of this
who
was in
cast
2014, yeah?
Yeah. So, of course, Victor, being the amazing human being that he is, became not a pastor, a chaplain, and when the full-scale invasion happened, and so the guy's amazing, and there's so many. For whatever reason, I meet so many chaplains, and so people want to go there. People of faith want to go to the front and help sustain their armed forces and help give them faith and hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. Having talked to Victor during that interview, his optimism is incredible because he talks about being dragged into a basement and having a car battery hooked up to his feet, and yet he has this sunny optimism. Part of it's his wife and kid, I get it, but it's like that is the kind of mindset that does not come from anything on earth or any kind of political calculus. That has to come from somewhere else.
Yeah. No. Yeah, man. I am with you. He is an amazing human being. So, yeah. But I think that what I would like your listeners to think about is these are people like them. These are Baptists. These are Presbyterians. They are being tortured for their faith, and it's because there's many pastors who will tell you that when the Russians come, they have orders to go to the Protestant churches first. And this
Wow.
is not something that gets out there. This is not something that gets out there.
Wow. So what's the future looking like? It's not all bright, I presume, but from where you're sitting,
Yeah.
where do you see
Well,
the future of this? Where do you see this ending? Honestly.
yeah. Um, and listen, I'm usually a bright, sunny, optimistic person, but I am going to depart from that today
Yeah.
because so if I think that this bill will get passed somehow, and here's how it goes. I talked to a bunch of members of Congress, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we'll get there." I can't tell you how. I don't know how it goes, but we'll get there. And so there's this optimism among the members of Congress I talked to.
Yeah, as long as it
Um,
takes, unless.
yeah, exactly. So and listen, if your listeners are supporters of aid to Ukraine, please have them call their member of Congress, have them call their U.S. senator, have them call their member of the House of Representatives, and tell them that Christians are being systematically tortured and murdered in Ukraine, and Congress needs to support Ukraine. So that would be something good people could do.
Yeah.
But here's what happens if we don't continue to support Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are currently running out of ammunition. I spoke earlier this week to my friends at the front, and all of them report similar stories. The Russian defenses are massive. They don't have the equipment they need. They're running out of not only artillery shells, but small arms weapons at this point, small arms artillery at this point. And their concern is that they've been on the offensive and they have not built defensive measures. And so if they are suddenly left without weapons, the Russians could roll through and make significant gains of territory. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like much of Ukraine coming under Russian control. That means, instead of tens of thousands of Ukrainian Protestants being tortured and murdered, it means hundreds of thousands and millions of Ukrainian Protestants being tortured and murdered and their faith suppressed. It means that Russia then comes up and has another border with NATO countries. Putin has been very clear. You got to take Putin's word. We do this thing. Some people hear Putin say things and they interpret it. Just take him his word. He says that Poland's next. He says that they're going to go into the Baltics. They're going to take the Baltics. Take him at his word. Now, I mentioned earlier that Putin's warfighting capability has been degraded by half at this point. But the estimates are 3 to 4 years before he goes back to pre-2022 weaponry, where he goes to the level of military capacity that he had before going to Ukraine. So we have a horrific 3 or 4 years where all kinds of horrible stories will be coming out of Ukraine. And then we have a point at which Putin will pick a fight and will go into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or Poland. And I've heard people, very smart people, members of Congress have told me, oh, Putin's never going to go into a NATO country. That's not what those countries think. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all those countries that border Ukraine and border Russia are spending massive amounts of their GDP to help Ukraine. And so they think that Putin will go into their country. So the people with the most information, the most to lose, think Putin will invade them after he invades Ukraine. So then you will have a fight in Europe. And if we have a fight in Europe, it will disrupt trade in the Baltic Sea, which is something about 5% of U.S. trade comes out of the Baltic Sea. Does not include other parts of Europe that may be eventually disrupted, which would be massive, massive amounts of trade disruption. It would be a change in the way of life for the American people. Now, that's just in Europe. Now, let's look at what the message this is that sends to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping looks at this and he says, really? All I got to do is wait for 2 years after I go into Taiwan and the world will forget about it? So he will see the global coalition supporting Ukraine unravel and he will be emboldened to go into Taiwan. Similarly, Iran will feel like there's no penalty for bad behavior. They'll say, it worked for Putin. Let's take a run at Israel. So at that point, you have three massive wars going on. And at that point, what does the U.S. look like? Well, the economy that we have right now cannot be sustained when the global economy is being disrupted by war. So the quality of life that Americans enjoy right now will be taken down. And that's if things go well. If things don't go well, and they probably won't, then you're going to see jihadic activity sponsored by the Iranians. You're going to see infrastructure attacks from the Chinese. There's all kinds of reports out there about how vulnerable our infrastructure is, our electricity, our air traffic control system, our communication system. There's a very good chance that the attack on America will not look like Pearl Harbor. It will be electronic. It will be insidious. It will be pervasive. And at that point, we are going to have to send in troops if we still have the capability to defend ourselves. So again, for $42 billion, we have cut one of our adversaries' warfighting capability in half. For another $60 billion, we're going to do a lot more. So we can take one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse off the table. And when I say the four horsemen of the apocalypse, I say Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. So these folks are working together to destroy the West.
Yeah.
We are in World War III, and the only people acting on that information is our adversaries.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to see, even within the context of current political debates, how that whole idea breaks down in terms of people who are more isolationist versus people who really do see, and there is a serious argument to be made that all of these things are very connected in terms of an overturning of the current structure of the international order. So in a sense, every domino matters.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah.
But hey, you know what? What matters right now is that you're doing really important work for the people in Ukraine on the ground, which is not work that a lot of people are doing. It's not a work that a lot of people understand, and I wish more people did. Maybe this will help in some small way to bring awareness to that. And for that, I mean, you deserve full props, Steve.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Well, you've been a good partner. You and I have worked together on getting the word out, and I appreciate everything you've done. Please keep it up.
Absolutely, man. Hey, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
An absolute delight.
All right. Great to talk to you guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.